What makes a leader be remembered in history? Is it their strategic intelligence, their ability to manipulate millions of people, or the impact of their decisions in building and destroying empires? World War II was not just a conflict of weapons and soldiers. It was a game of power, where some of the most ambitious and dangerous minds in history made decisions that forever changed the course of the world. We're not just talking about military commanders, but about men who personified war in its purest form, figures who, with a single speech, could determine the life or death of millions. Among them, 5 stand out: Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Benito Mussolini. Each, in their own way, was a true architect of the conflict. Some led their nations to victory. Others were lost in illusions of power and ended up destroying their own countries. But what made the difference? What separated the victors from the defeated? Was it merely luck? Or was there something deeper, a factor that defined who would fall and who would become an immortal symbol? This video is not just about war, but about the decisions that shaped history. We will analyze the strategies, the failures, and the moments that turned these leaders into legends, some glorious, others tragic. And above all, we will explore the lessons these events carry for today's world and for your own life. Welcome to SCHEFFER Vision. Benito Mussolini wanted to be remembered as the new emperor of Rome, a leader who would restore Italy's glory and establish it as a global power. But in the end, what remained was a defeated, abandoned, and humiliated dictator captured like an ordinary man trying to flee disguised as a soldier. But how did he reach this point? Mussolini was no ordinary leader. He was one of the first modern politicians to master the power of propaganda. He crafted an image of strength, discipline, and absolute authority, turning fascism into a grand spectacle. His speeches were theatrical, his military parades imposing, and the illusion that Italy was an unstoppable power was everywhere. But the truth was entirely different. While Nazi Germany grew into an overwhelming military force, Mussolini's Italy was fragile, disorganized, and militarily unprepared. His tanks were inferior, his troops poorly trained, and his economy incapable of sustaining a prolonged war. But Mussolini did not see reality, only his own fantasy. This illusion led him to make one of the most disastrous decisions of World War II, the invasion of Greece. Mussolini wanted to prove to Hitler that he too was a bold military leader capable of expanding his empire without relying on the Germans. But he ignored one crucial detail. Italy was not prepared for this war. What was supposed to be a swift victory turned into a brutal humiliation. The Greeks resisted and pushed the Italians back, defeating an army that was theoretically superior. Humiliated, Mussolini was forced to ask Hitler for help, and German troops had to intervene to save the Italians. From that moment on, it became clear that Mussolini was not a strategist, he was a follower. He became entirely dependent on Nazi Germany, dragging Italy into the chaos of global war. But Mussolini's illusion of power did not last long. As the war progressed and the Allies landed in Italy, the people who once cheered for him began turning against him. In 1943, he was deposed and imprisoned by his own government. Hitler, still believing in him, ordered his rescue and reinstated him as the leader of a puppet regime in northern Italy. But by then, Mussolini was nothing more than a shadow of the dictator he had once been. When he realized everything was lost, he tried to escape, but reality, which he had avoided for so long, finally caught up with him. Captured by Italian partisans, Mussolini was executed, and his body was publicly displayed hanging upside down in a Milan square. A humiliating end for a man who once saw himself as an emperor. The great lesson from Mussolini's story: no propaganda can change reality. No illusion survives when confronted with facts. He believed he could build an empire with words and military parades alone. But when war arrived, it became clear that true power does not come from appearances. It comes from preparation and strategy. And you? Are you making decisions based on facts? Or are you deceiving yourself with illusions that will eventually collapse? Adolf Hitler began World War II with an astonishing advance, conquering entire countries at a speed the world had never seen before. Germany seemed unstoppable. Within months, his army dominated France, forced the United Kingdom onto the defensive, and expanded its forces across Eastern Europe. The Blitzkrieg, his lightning war strategy, shocked Western leaders, and his confidence grew with each victory. But this rapid expansion created a fatal illusion, the belief that the Third Reich was invincible. With most of Europe under his control, Hitler decided that the next natural step was the conquest of the Soviet Union. To him, the Red Army was nothing more than a disorganized force that would fall as easily as the other nations. Thus, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Initially, the Nazis advanced with brutal efficiency, destroying thousands of Soviet troops and closing in on Moscow. But Hitler failed to see that he was repeating a historical mistake. Napoleon had already tried to conquer Russia and failed, and now history was about to repeat itself. The Soviet resistance was far greater than he had anticipated. The Russian winter, which Hitler believed would not be an issue, turned into a nightmare for his troops. Tanks stopped functioning, soldiers froze to death, and the war that was supposed to last a few months dragged on for years. The definitive turning point came at the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Germans were surrounded, humiliated, and forced to surrender. From that moment on, the Third Reich began to collapse. But Hitler refused to retreat. Instead of recognizing his mistakes and attempting to reorganize his forces, he isolated himself. He became paranoid, distrusted his own generals, and insisted on increasingly irrational strategies. He ordered battalions that no longer existed into battle, issued impossible commands, and refused to accept the reality of the war. The world around him was crumbling, yet he still believed he could win. In the final months of the war, as the Allies closed in from all sides, Hitler locked himself inside his bunker in Berlin. The city lay in ruins, and the Soviets were only blocks away from his fortress. Yet he continued to speak of counterattacks, of divisions that would come to rescue him, of an impossible victory. The illusion he had built for himself was so immense that even in the face of total collapse, he refused to admit defeat. On April 30, 1945, unable to accept reality, Hitler committed suicide. The man who once commanded armies that dominated Europe ended his life hidden away, isolated, and ultimately defeated by his own uncontrolled ambition. His downfall was not just the war itself, but his inability to recognize his own limits. He believed he was infallible, that he could bend history to his will, and this arrogance led to his destruction. The lesson Hitler leaves behind is clear. Ambition can take someone far, but if left unchecked, it can also be their downfall. How many people have lost everything by clinging to the wrong idea, refusing to accept reality? How many have been destroyed because they failed to recognize when to stop? History shows us that those who do not learn to control their ambition and listen to reality will sooner or later face an inevitable downfall. Joseph Stalin was not a leader driven by impulse or vanity. Unlike Hitler, who was guided by his belief in absolute victory, Stalin saw war as a game of patience and brutality, where the only objective was to endure until the enemy was completely worn down. However, at the start of World War II, he was caught off guard. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Stalin refused to believe that Germany would actually invade the Soviet Union. Even with intelligence reports warning of the imminent attack, he ignored the alerts. So when German tanks crossed the border, the Red Army was completely unprepared and crushed in the first assault. The first weeks of the invasion were catastrophic. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured, cities were destroyed. Germany seemed to be marching toward Moscow without resistance. The world believed Stalin was on the brink of defeat, but it was then that he revealed the defining trait of his wartime leadership, the ability to endure the worst and keep fighting. Instead of retreating or negotiating peace, Stalin doubled down, ordering that any soldier who abandoned his position be treated as a traitor. Cities were sacrificed, millions died, but he kept the Soviet Union standing at any cost. The definitive turning point came at Stalingrad. Hitler wanted the city not just for its strategic value, but because it bore Stalin's name, making its conquest a matter of prestige. Stalin, knowing this, ordered that the city be defended at all costs. The battle turned into a brutal urban nightmare, where soldiers fought street by street, building by building, until the Germans found themselves encircled. In February 1943, the Red Army accomplished the impossible. It forced hundreds of thousands of Nazi soldiers to surrender, shifting the momentum of the war. But this victory came at an unimaginable human cost. Unlike Churchill or Roosevelt, Stalin did not see people as individuals but as numbers on a chessboard. To him, war was a battle of attrition in which the Soviet Union had to win regardless of the sacrifices. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were sent to die, often without enough weapons, just to wear down the Nazi troops. If a German army destroyed a Soviet division, another was sent immediately after, then another and another until the enemy simply could no longer fight. As the Soviet forces advanced after Stalingrad, Stalin began expanding his influence across Europe. While the Allies fought the Nazis in the West, the Soviets swept through Eastern Europe, imposing communist governments in every conquered territory. By the time Hitler fell and Germany surrendered, Stalin had already ensured that half of Europe was under his control. This marked the birth of the Iron Curtain and the beginning of the Cold War. Stalin's role in World War II is an example of how patience, endurance, and sheer brutality can change the course of a conflict. He proved that it was not necessary to strike first to win a war. Sometimes it was enough to survive, wait for the right moment, and crush the enemy with a counterattack. But the price of this victory was paid by the Soviet people, who suffered under a regime just as cruel as the threat they were fighting against. Stalin didn't just defeat Hitler by the end of the war, he ensured that he would be the one dictating the new rules of the world. When all seemed lost, when Europe was kneeling before the relentless advance of Nazi Germany, only one man stood between Hitler and absolute control of the continent: Winston Churchill. While France and Poland fell, while Mussolini allied with the Axis and Stalin temporarily negotiated with the Nazis, Britain stood alone. Isolated, with a smaller army and surrounded by enemies, any rational leader might have sought a peace agreement. But Churchill was not an ordinary leader. From the moment he took office as Prime Minister in 1940, Churchill made it clear that there would be no negotiation with Hitler. He knew that if Britain fell, the entire world would follow. The only option was resistance, no matter the cost. But how do you keep a nation fighting when all odds are against it? How do you prevent the fear of defeat from breaking the spirit of a people whose cities were being bombed daily? The answer lay in something as powerful as weapons and armies: oratory. Churchill used words as a weapon of war, igniting the spirit of the British people and turning fear into determination. In his speeches in Parliament and on the radio, he did not promise an easy victory. On the contrary, he warned that the path ahead would be arduous, that there would be losses, but that under no circumstances would Britain surrender. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." These words echoed like a battle cry, uniting the nation around the idea of resistance. But speeches alone do not win battles. Churchill knew that to have any chance of defeating Hitler, he needed allies. His greatest diplomatic achievement was convincing the United States to enter the war. Even before Pearl Harbor, he was already in close contact with Franklin D. Roosevelt, ensuring that American industry would supply Britain with weapons, resources, and logistical support. Churchill understood that alone, Britain could not defeat Germany, but with the United States and the Soviet Union on his side, the tide of war could change. And the strategy worked. Despite suffering a series of defeats early on, Britain held on. Over time, the entry of the United States into the conflict and the Soviet Union's counteroffensive in the East shifted the balance of power. With Churchill playing a key role in Allied strategy, Nazi Germany finally collapsed in 1945, and he stood among the great victors. But his journey took an unexpected turn. Just months after victory, Churchill was voted out of office in the British Lichess. The very people he had inspired and led through the darkest moments of the war decided they needed new leadership for peacetime. Still, his legacy remained undeniable. Churchill not only saved Britain from collapse, but also helped shape the post-war world. And perhaps most importantly, he proved that true leadership does not come solely from military power, but from the ability to inspire, unite, and convince an entire nation to fight for what it believes in. Winston Churchill was the last barrier against Nazi domination. Without him, history could have been completely different. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office as President of the United States at a critical moment. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression, and most Americans wanted to stay far away from international conflicts. When World War II broke out in Europe, Roosevelt knew that Nazi Germany posed a global threat, but he faced a nation reluctant to join the fight. He had to act with patience, balancing domestic politics with the global situation. While Hitler advanced through Europe and Japan expanded its dominance in the Pacific, Roosevelt used alternative means to influence the war. Without directly engaging in combat, the United States became the great arsenal of the Allied nations, supplying weapons, resources, and logistical support to Britain and the Soviet Union. The American industry, fueled by government incentives, began operating at an unprecedented level. Within months, the US was producing more tanks, planes, and ammunition than any other country in the world. But Roosevelt knew that financing the war alone would not be enough. Sooner or later, the US would have to fight. The decisive moment came with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. What had once seemed like a distant war was now a direct threat, and Roosevelt seized on national outrage to bring the United States into the conflict. In a historic speech, he declared it a date which will live in infamy, and within hours the entire country was mobilized for war. But entering the war was just the first step. Now, Roosevelt had to ensure that the US led the fight against the Axis powers strategically. He masterfully balanced diplomacy and military force. On one hand, he worked closely with Winston Churchill to ensure that Europe remained the top priority, preventing Hitler from solidifying his control. On the other hand, he coordinated an aggressive Pacific campaign against Japan. While American soldiers fought on two fronts, Roosevelt actively participated in global decisions, shaping the strategy that would lead to victory. The industrial superiority of the United States soon became undeniable. The Germans and Japanese simply could not match the pace of American production. For every tank destroyed, the US produced 10 more. Every downed plane was replaced by a new fleet. Well-equipped and well-supplied, American troops became an overwhelming force. Roosevelt did not live to see the war's end. In April 1945, just months before Germany and Japan surrendered, he passed away, leaving Harry Truman to oversee the final victory. But his legacy extended far beyond the war. He was one of the architects of the New World Order, playing a key role in the creation of the United Nations, UN, and laying the foundation for America's global influence in the 20th century. If Hitler and Mussolini tried to reshape the world through brute force, Roosevelt did it through strategy and patience. He did not rush into war on impulse, nor did he make reckless decisions out of pride. Instead, he played a long game, ensuring that when the United States finally entered the battlefield, it would be to decide the fate of the war and the world. Japan's history in World War II is marked by a dangerous belief, the illusion of invincibility. For decades, the country cultivated an image of absolute strength, rooted in extreme nationalism, strict military discipline, and the idea that its army could never be defeated. With a warrior culture that glorified death in combat and unquestionable loyalty to the emperor, Japan embarked on an aggressive expansion campaign across Asia and the Pacific. But this overconfidence led to one of the greatest defeats in modern history. Japan's history in World War II is marked by a dangerous belief, the illusion of invincibility. At the start of the war, Japan's military strategy seemed unstoppable. Its army was highly trained, its navy technologically advanced, and its conquests were swift and brutal. China, Southeast Asia, and numerous Pacific islands fell under Japanese control in a short period. But Japan's military leaders made a fatal mistake. They underestimated their enemies, particularly the United States. They believed they could win a prolonged war solely through courage and discipline, ignoring America's massive industrial capacity and the resilience of the Allies. The greatest symbol of this arrogance was the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In a surprise strike, the Japanese Navy destroyed much of the US Pacific Fleet, believing this would leave the Americans defenseless and force them into a favorable peace agreement. But the effect was the exact opposite. The attack ignited an unprecedented national fury in the United States and gave Franklin D. Roosevelt the perfect justification to enter the war. What Japanese leaders failed to predict was that the US, with its immense production capacity, would quickly rebuild its fleet and retaliate with overwhelming force. The Pacific War became brutally intense. The Japanese refused to surrender, fighting to the death on every island in grueling battles such as Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They were willing to sacrifice everything, convinced that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. But this strategy came at an enormous human cost. While American forces adopted pragmatic tactics to minimize their losses, the Japanese military threw thousands of lives away in suicidal attacks, including the infamous kamikaze pilots. However, reality could not be ignored forever. The war became unsustainable for Japan, and total destruction was only a matter of time. Yet, even when defeat was inevitable, Japan's leadership insisted on fighting. The country was on the brink of collapse, but the idea of surrender remained unthinkable for the military command. Then came the final decision. In August 1945, the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly killing hundreds of thousands of people and leaving behind unimaginable devastation. Faced with this horrific reality and the imminent Allied invasion of Japan, Emperor Hirohito finally broke centuries-old tradition and announced Japan's surrender. Japan's illusion of invincibility was shattered in the most devastating way possible. The nation had bet everything on the belief that it could win through determination and sacrifice, but ignored the realities of modern warfare, where technology, strategy, and logistics mattered more than simply fighting to the last man. In the end, the war proved that arrogance can be just as destructive as any bomb, and that underestimating the enemy is the first step toward defeat. Great wars are not won by brute force alone, but by strategy. Likewise, they are not lost solely because of weaker armies, but due to poor decisions, many of which could have been avoided. World War II was defined by strategic blunders so significant that they didn't just cost battles, they completely altered the outcome of the war. Some of these mistakes were born from arrogance, others from miscalculations, and some were simply the inability to see reality as it was. One of the greatest mistakes of the war was Hitler's underestimation of Soviet resistance. Convinced that the Red Army was weak and disorganized, he ignored the warnings of his own generals and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. At first, it seemed like his gamble had paid off. The Nazis advanced rapidly, destroying entire Soviet divisions and reaching the outskirts of Moscow. But Hitler failed to account for two critical factors: the vastness of the Soviet Union and the harsh Russian winter. As the German advance slowed, the Soviets regrouped and turned the war into a battle of attrition. By the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, it was clear that Germany had not only overestimated its own strength, but had also underestimated an enemy willing to sacrifice millions to win. What was supposed to be a short campaign lasting months dragged on for years, and the Third Reich never recovered from this error. Mussolini also played a role in his own downfall by engaging in battles he could not win. His attempt to invade Greece was a decision based on pride and illusion, with no consideration for the actual strength of his forces. What should have been a quick victory turned into a disaster, forcing Hitler to intervene and divert crucial resources away from the German war effort. Italy's failure exposed Mussolini's military weakness, and as the war progressed, it became clear that he was not a leader capable of handling such a massive conflict. The consequence? His downfall, the Allied invasion of Italy, and eventually his capture and execution. Japan, on the other hand, sealed its own fate with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The strike was a devastating blow to the United States, but Japanese leaders failed to consider America's industrial capacity to rebuild and retaliate with overwhelming force. What was intended as a preemptive strike to weaken the US instead gave Franklin D. Roosevelt the perfect justification to enter the war with the full might of the nation. Japan, which had hoped to wear down the Americans and force negotiations, ended up awakening an enemy it could never hope to defeat in the long run. Each of these errors stemmed from the same fundamental flaw: the failure to recognize reality. Hitler believed he could conquer the Soviet Union with ease. Mussolini thought he could become a great military leader without having an army capable of supporting his ambitions. Japan assumed it could challenge the United States without suffering the consequences. In the end, all of them paid the price for these illusions. World War II could have had a completely different outcome if these leaders had made more rational decisions. But history shows that arrogance, pride, and overconfidence are dangerous weapons, often more destructive than any bomb or army. The fate of the war was not just decided on the battlefield, but in the moments when its key leaders miscalculated, and those mistakes cost millions of lives and changed the world forever. World War II was not just a battle of armies and nations. It was a confrontation between different leadership styles, a test of who could adapt, who could endure, and who would crumble under the weight of their own decisions. The war did not belong only to the soldiers on the front lines, but to the minds that commanded them. Every major leader of that period shaped the world in some way, some through brilliant decisions, others through catastrophic mistakes. But what truly separated the victors from the defeated? Was it sheer military strength, or was there something deeper, something in the way they understood power and used it to their advantage? One of the most striking lessons from this war is the balance between ambition and reality. Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese military leaders were obsessed with the idea of absolute greatness. They believed in the unquestionable strength of their nations and the inevitability of their dominance. Their vision of power was one of expansion at all costs, of conquest without limits, but none of them understood the boundaries of their own capabilities. Hitler was convinced he could bring the Soviet Union to its knees in a matter of months. Mussolini saw himself as a modern emperor, but lacked an army capable of making his ambitions a reality. Japan believed it could defeat the United States without considering the industrial force that stood against it. Each of them ignored the reality before their eyes, and in doing so, sealed their own destruction. Meanwhile, Churchill and Roosevelt approached leadership differently. They knew that victory would not come overnight, that true power was not in grandiose declarations, but in patience, calculation, and adaptability. They fought wars of endurance, not just of force. While their enemies were blinded by their own illusions, they adjusted, retreated when necessary, and advanced when the time was right. They played a long game, one that only those willing to see beyond immediate victories could win. Another undeniable lesson is the danger of isolation. Leaders who refuse to listen, who surround themselves only with those who agree with them, inevitably walk toward disaster. Hitler dismissed his most experienced generals when they contradicted him, preferring instead to hear only what confirmed his own beliefs. Stalin, in his paranoia, executed his own officers before the war, weakening his military leadership at the worst possible moment. When power becomes an echo chamber, where no dissenting voices remain, reality becomes a distant threat, one that eventually strikes without mercy. Roosevelt and Churchill, on the other hand, understood the importance of listening. They trusted their military advisors, adjusted strategies when necessary, and never allowed arrogance to cloud their judgment. They knew that war was not about proving themselves right, but about making the right decisions, no matter how difficult. Arrogance played a decisive role in the downfall of many leaders. Mussolini believed he could dictate military strategies alone, ignoring the advice of specialists. Hitler refused to retreat even when his armies were collapsing. Japan chose to fight until the last breath, even when the war was already lost. Pride, more than any enemy force, led to their ruin. They believed themselves untouchable, incapable of failure, and when reality finally caught up with them, it did so with devastating force. But war does not belong to the proud. It belongs to those who endure, who strategize, who understand that true power is not in an unshakable belief in one's own superiority, but in the ability to adapt. Stalin suffered defeat after defeat at the beginning of the war, but he persisted, reorganized, and turned his losses into learning. Churchill did not lead any great land victories early on, but his words kept Britain standing until the moment to strike arrived. Roosevelt waited, played his cards carefully, and ensured that when the United States finally entered the war, it did so not as another struggling nation, but as the decisive force that would shape the world's future. Looking back at these lessons, it becomes clear that World War II is not just history. It is a mirror reflecting the timeless patterns of leadership, success, and failure. The difference between those who prevail and those who fall is not just in intelligence or charisma, but in the ability to balance ambition with reality, to listen to those around them, to control pride, and to adapt when necessary. The war is over, but its lessons remain. And the question that lingers is simple. Are you learning from the mistakes of those who fell, or are you walking the same path that led them to their downfall? World War II was a turning point in human history, but war itself never truly ended. The world has changed, weapons have evolved, but the essence of conflict, the struggle for power and control, remains as present as ever. Nations still compete for territory, influence, and resources. But now, the battlefield is not just physical. If in the past the warlords commanded armies and destroyed cities with tanks and bombs, today global dominance happens in far more subtle ways. Modern wars are no longer fought only with soldiers on the battlefield. We now live in an era where war is waged through economics, technology, information, and even artificial intelligence. Instead of tanks crossing borders, we see economic sanctions crippling entire nations. Instead of bombs leveling cities, cyber attacks can shut down power grids and banking systems. Instead of fiery speeches in public squares, social media algorithms manipulate public opinion and shape governments. During World War II, the world witnessed the rise of Hitler and Stalin as absolute figures of totalitarian power. Today, new versions of power-hungry leaders emerge, operating in different ways, but with equally dangerous ambitions. The pursuit of control has not stopped. Some nations concentrate massive power in the hands of their leaders, while others use technology corporations and financial institutions to shape entire societies without people even realizing it. Modern warfare happens every single day, but few truly recognize it. The lessons of the past remain crucial for understanding the present and the future. The mistakes of Hitler, Mussolini, and Imperial Japan showed that arrogance, pride, and underestimating the enemy lead to downfall. On the other hand, the strategies of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin teach us that patience, adaptability, and long-term vision are essential for those who seek victory. Today, these same principles still apply. but in a new game where those who control the narrative, the economy, and technology hold more power than any military force. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these lessons impacted you the most? Leave your comment below. I read them all. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to understand how the world really works. See you in the next video.